I would like to be able to say it is a joy to be standing up here, but that would be lying, really. Although it is always a joy to be able to tell of what the Lord has done for us. So I know that during this last year you have been having testimonies every Sunday evening, and I've been here for some of them, and others I've heard on the internet or listened to on DVD. And although I haven't done an analysis of them, most of them have started off something along the lines saying, I was privileged to be born into a Christian home, or privileged to be brought up in a Christian home. And tonight my testimony is no different. I was privileged to be born into a Christian home. And as I was thinking about that, I began to think about some of those privileges. And what I want to do just for a few moments tonight is just look at some of the privileges which were afforded me by being born into a Christian home. And the first privilege is something which, being born in a Christian home generally means that we are born into a stable, loving relationship where we're brought up by our own father and mother. Now that's not something that, when we look at the wider society today, we can take for granted. So it's something to be thankful for, that in a Christian home, that is something that I was brought up by my own father and mother who loved each other and loved me. But there was much more important than that, because I was born into a home where God was honoured and He lived in the lives of my parents. And from birth I was taught about God, not just about Him, but by the example that was set by my parents. I could see Christ in their lives, and we were taken along to church as soon as we were able to sit up. In those days we didn't have a cry room, so we weren't like nowadays brought out a week after we were born. But as soon as we were old enough to go and sit in the service, we were taken. We went to Sunday school, where we learned the truths of the gospel, and also were taught them at home. I grew up in a very exciting time in the growth of the Free Church during the 60s and the 70s. And during that time there was an exceptional growth years, particularly after 1966, those of you who remember it, the imprisonment of Dr. Paisley and his colleagues. And we, as children, during that time, we probably didn't realize how exciting it was, but we never missed a church opening. And I always remember we were regularly, on a Saturday, we would head off somewhere all across the country to an opening of a church, and there was lots of them during the last part of the 60s and early 70s. Easter Convention at the Martyrs, we went there. Originally it was the old Ravenhill Church, then the Ulster Hall, then the Martyrs. We were always there, all three services. But as well as being involved in the Free Church, Dad was also a representative of the Faith Mission, and he was also involved in lots of other missionary organisations. So we used to be quite regularly attending various mission halls, various meetings. We used to go to things called rejoinings. They always seemed to be in some hall somewhere in the middle of nowhere, lit by tilly lamps, and I always seemed to be sitting beside the supersare heater, getting my legs burnt. But despite all of this, being born into a Christian home, all these privileges of the gospel, that didn't make me a Christian. That's something that I know a lot of the young people here who grew up in the church just always remember that just because you go to all the services, because you're brought up in the church environment, becoming a Christian can only be gained through a personal faith and trust in Christ. So I thank God that at a young age, I don't recall the actual date and the time, but when I was probably about 7 years of age, one night my mum was praying with me before we went to bed, and I asked Jesus to save me. And, there probably wasn't much of an outward change in my life at 7. I'm not sure that I was a particularly big sinner at 7. But, my heart was still desperately wicked. The Bible tells us that our hearts are desperately wicked and that we need to be saved. And even all the righteousnesses that I might have thought I had by going to church and doing good, in Isaiah 64, we read in verse 6 that all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, and that was how God saw me. So that night, I believe I was saved, that first night when I gave my life to Christ. because in John 6 and verse 37, he tells us that if we come to him, he won't cast us out. And, I believe I was saved that night. But yet, during my early teenage years and going to secondary school, I used to struggle quite a lot with doubts, and the devil used to come and say, "Oh, you couldn't be saved, you've done that, or you've done this, or whatever." And I used to spend a lot of time asking God to save me again, asking for forgiveness again. But one of the privileges that I had, which really helped me with these doubts, was that, as I said, Dad was involved in lots of works in the church, and lots of Christians, ministers, missionaries used to visit our house. And particularly in the early days in Cabra, and there always seemed to be people coming for lunch, and we lots of men who were real stalwarts of faith. Dr. Paisley used to visit regularly. Dr. Bill Woods was a regular visitor. In fact, he came long before he was a doctor to our house. And apparently, I'm told that whenever I was 3 years old, I screamed because I didn't like his moustache. And he still reminds me of that when I meet him to this day. Another regular visitor who used to come to our house was the Reverend John Wiley when he retired to Ballymoney, and he was another great man of faith. And within our own family, we were blessed to have my uncle was the Reverend Cecil Maneri, a minister in the church. And as children growing up, spending time with these men, and particularly somebody like Cecil. Now, I know Elizabeth won't mind me saying here, Cecil, when he was in the pulpit, he always looked a very exact and almost stern man. He was always quite severe. At least that's what we thought he looked like when we were children. But out of the pulpit, he was a brilliant communicator. He was an amazing man, and he had a great love for sport, a great love for lots of things. And as children growing up, and particularly for me, I could see in Cecil that here was someone who, yes, he was a minister, he was a really godly man, but he could also enjoy other things. And he was also, hockey was one of his great loves. And I remember he used to take us to hockey matches. It always seemed to be on a freezing cold day somewhere around Lisburn. But, people like that, the privileges that we had of meeting these people, there was lots of other people who used to come to the church. And these people helped me develop my faith and helped me to grow. Even as we used to sit on Sunday afternoons after lunch, listening to Dad, talking to these men about the things of God, they would help me realize some of the great truths of the gospel, how that, it wasn't what I had done that had saved me, but it was what he had done on the cross. It was his work on the cross. Yes, I had come to him in repentance. I had had to come. I had a responsibility. And as we were reminded this morning in the service by Mr. Brown, we have a responsibility in the gospel to come. But, we are not, it's not anything that we do that saves us, because we are saved by the power of the gospel. Through those years of listening to these men and being with them and spending time, I believe that I came to assurance of Christ, that I knew that God would never fail me. And what I didn't know at that time was that I would spend most of my life outside of Northern Ireland. I would be away from, as it were, my comfort zone of being surrounded by people and things that I had grown up with, and in many respects, it was easy to sort of mingle in with the church, come to church, and it was always comfortable because you knew what to expect. But God was I believe given me this exposure to some of these men and the great truths of the gospel, so that when I did move away, then I would be able to. When I was on my own and had to then question, that I had to really understand what the full fundamentals of the gospel were. Sometimes we can drift along just in a comfort zone, not realizing maybe exactly what we believe. And when we're put in a very difficult position, then sometimes we're not sure which way to jump. But I'm thankful that this gave me the ability to, whenever I moved away, to be able to then, as it were, test the things that were happening. Because when you move away, things sometimes are different. And just because they're different doesn't mean that they're wrong. You got to get beneath the surface and look and say, well, why? Because someone does something a different way. does that mean it's wrong? And again, it was something was mentioned this morning. Are there different ways to evangelize? Is it wrong to do something that may be just a little bit different from the norm? But I thank God that He has given me in the privilege that I had of meeting and developing my knowledge of the gospel. Then I've been able to discern between what's right and what's wrong, and be able to sort of live when we've been away now for almost over 30 years. And another very important privilege that I had in growing up in the church and living in a Christian home was it was there that I met my wife. And Arlene and I have been married now for over 30 years, and we left Ballymoney on one condition, that we would be away for 2 years. That was the ultimatum I was given. We'll go for 2 years. Ali's not very good at counting, so here we are, 30 years later, and we're still, by God's grace, He has kept us together, and that's something that I praise God for, and He's kept us going on with Him. Now, I've mentioned the privileges of meeting all these different people, and I just want, as I close, to mention some particular people. And I don't want to embarrass them, but I just want to mention them because these are people who were influential in my life and who I believe helped me immensely. Next to my mum and dad, who were a great influence to me, the greatest influence is Sadie. And I only pay tribute to her tonight because, as well as being family, Sadie was also a tremendous influence in my life. From the very early days out there in Cabra, Sadie used to come in that famous Mini, as many of you have heard of, and pick us up, take us to the youth fellowship, take us to children's meetings, take us to choir practices, she just seemed to be always, the Mini was always coming up the drive. But then as we grew up, we went through the youth fellowship, and particularly in the times of the quiz. And no one will ever know the time that Sadie spent researching and studying for the quiz team that we had. And those of us who were on the quiz team, we grew spiritually through some of the studies that we did, the in-depth studies through that quiz. And a lot of that was down to Sadie. And today, Sadie's still an invaluable support to us as a family, and I pay tribute to her. And another influence was Albert. Albert, we all know him as an exceptional man. Through his teaching in the Sunday school, we came up through the Sunday school as superintendent. In the Bible class, his teaching was, as well as being based on the Bible, biblical, it was practical. Albert didn't just teach theory. He was a living example of a practical Christian. And I owe a lot to him, again, in those early years coming up through the Sunday school Bible class, what he taught me. And then the third key influence in my life was Dr. Kearns. And I'm glad to see him sitting down here tonight. When we grew up in Cabra and Ballymoney, sitting under his ministry, that was singularly the greatest influence in the growth of me as a young Christian. It wasn't just through the Sunday services, where the depth of Bible teaching there was amazing, and yet it was delivered in a way that even as teenagers we could understand it, but also through the youth fellowship, and particularly the young people's holidays, where we were taught the truths of the gospel in a very different environment. It was there, it was more informal. We had times of fun and fellowship, but yet some of the Bible teaching, I'll always remember, I think it might have been the Sheringham holiday, where we did a series on the minor prophets. Now you might think, oh, that's a bit heavy for a young people's holiday. But, up until that time, I'd probably known of Jonah. But I remember vividly those talks through each morning. We would have a talk going through Amos, Micah, etc. And all the time, Dr. Kearns was pointing us to Christ through the minor prophets. The whole Bible, and that was one of the times when I realized, the Old Testament all pointed towards Christ. And something just, I was glad to hear this morning that there's a youth weekend being planned, because I feel that it's something I feel very strongly about, is that young people's work, particularly holidays, groups getting away together, is times whenever a great growth can take place. And as I say, we've been away living in England for nearly 30 years, and the church we attend there, Baptist Church, we've got links with a number of organisations who run these annual camps in Wales under EMW, Evangelical Movement of Wales. And, every time lots of our young people go there, and every time we have a baptismal service, I can safely say that nearly every one of the young people that are baptized speak of how they either became Christians at these camps or they came to assurance of faith. So it's a great work to be involved in, and I'm very thankful for the time that we spent on those holidays. So finally, I just want to thank the Lord for giving me these many privileges that He afforded me of growing up in a Christian home, and I would encourage and challenge young people here, if you don't consider it a privilege. When we were doing it, I probably didn't always think, when we were getting piled into the back of the car on a Saturday afternoon to drive off to Armagh or Kilkeel or Enniskillen or somewhere, we didn't necessarily always think it was a privilege. And, in those days, cars didn't have CDs and DVDs, and sometimes the heater didn't even work. But thank God, and I thank Mum and Dad that they did it, that, we went. That was part of our upbringing. It was part of and it was a privilege, because it was through that we established our faith. And in Ecclesiastes 12 we're told, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth." And thank God He saved me when I was young, and afforded me these privileges of meeting so many different people that have influenced my life and that have helped me in my walk with Him. So, young person, just make sure that you come to Him when you're young, and then live your life for Him. Thank you.